World Regions Geography, 110, Sub-Saharan Africa, Part 5, Visualizing Geography. So there's a project called the Millennium Development Goals. And what those goals are to eradicate poverty by the end of this century. Universal primary education means everybody goes to school. Right now, in most of Africa, children, a family has to choose between their male and female students if they can send either. So the goal is to have everyone educated, both male and female. Promote gender equality. As in most of the developing world, there is a severe gender inequality, which women don't have the same rights. In some cases, it may be simply not being able to vote. In others, may not have economic rights, may not have rights to education. Basically, this program wants to promote gender equality, combat disease. Huge problem in Sub-Saharan Africa. Some of the worst diseases that threaten mankind as a whole come out of tropical regions, and this is a largely tropical region with lots of potential disease carriers and lots of severe diseases that are rampant. Ensure environmental stability. And this really takes in a lot of things. Not only as we think of environmental security as not polluting our rivers or maybe not polluting our land or having clean air, they also have to deal with issues like deforestation, desertification, long-term sustainability issues, the environment, particularly the soils in tropical regions typically are very poor soils, and therefore don't necessarily have the ability to make adjustments, and it can be very difficult to ensure both food security and the environment. Cultural and population, large, diverse region. So Sub-Saharan Africa takes in a lot of different groups. There are traditional religions, so shamanism, animism. There are hundreds of different ethnic groups. It tends to be a tribal society, so different tribes have historically been in different regions. They were thrust together when the Europeans at the Berlin Conference divided up the continent in what became colonies and eventually became nation states. And so now you have tribes that have a lot of animosity that were kept at bay by their colonial masters. Now they're vying for control, and so you see a lot of ethnic issues within Africa. Tribes, obviously, they can actually cross borders because you may have a tribe that was divided between two colonies, one French and one English, or one Belgian and one English, or, So this may not fit into the neat boundaries of a nation state. Largest ethnic groups are associated with dominant languages. So you have these large ethnic groups and dominant languages in Africa that are in some ways contributing to the problems and also trying to solve a lot of the problems. Religious and language, animus, that's the worship of nature. spread of Christianity and Islam. Dominant religions, of course, are Christianity and Islam. More than 1,000 living languages in Africa. It's incredibly diverse. And then you have some groups, as you see right here, the Mandi. This is a common language group. Now you have a number of different languages within that group, but that is a very common Bantoid. This region right up in here, another very common group of languages, different ethnicity on the people. You can see some of these different regions where you have different languages. I think, it's fairly interesting, but each of these is a separate little language. So there's a lot of diverse little languages that make communication more difficult. Cultural practices, social differences, and identity. So kinship is the basic basis of culture and identity within most regions of Africa. The land often is held traditionally in a community, by a community for community members' use, and that's why you have these land grabs where you have corporations or individuals coming in and buying up large tracts of this land, removing it from the community's use into private use. Music, art, and film. We don't often think of art or film and music being huge, other than people playing instruments, but there's a huge recording industry, there's a huge film industry, both in Nigeria. Musical traditions are very varied all over the continent. People have a lot of different musical traditions. Pop music, African art, Nollywood, which is Nigerian Hollywood. The two main sports that you find in Africa are soccer. You see kids playing it here, and African distance runners. Interestingly enough, there's not a lot of African sprinters running in the Olympics, mostly distance runners. Cultural practices and differences and identity continued as your changing roles of women. This term that you may read, and you'll see it in other parts of the world, mentioned feminization of poverty, which means that the men leave. Maybe they go to the city, they're earning some money. The women are left in poverty, and you see this really in our country in terms of single mothers with children on welfare. That is a form of feminization of poverty. It's not only does it exist in Africa, but it's in many other parts of the world. Patriarchy, in many places in the world, it just means that the man is ruling the family, and often owns all the assets and has all the rights in the marriage and in the family. That transfer of property rights so that women can own property, that's the only way you're going to reduce that feminization of poverty. Programs that recognize women's contribution. In Nigeria and some of the countries in West Africa, you see a lot of programs where women are raising small, maybe 10, 20 square feet or 20-foot square parcel of ground where they're raising vegetables to sell in the local market to get money to support themselves and their children. These are small programs that have been very successful in helping women get away from this poverty and be able to provide for their families One of the real problems also in Africa is AIDS and taking out the breadwinners or the people in the age group that would typically provide for children and for the old in their community. They're dead. And so you have in large parts of Central Africa, you have large populations of old and young, and nothing in the middle in terms of the population profile. Demography and urbanization, one of the fastest growing populations. Annual growth rate of 2.7%. Huge booming population. You see in various regions, Nigeria, huge birth rate, not death rate. You see right here, that is probably from the genocide, could be from AIDS, but that little blip in there. This one you see starting to level off, but the growth rate, population growth rate, is pretty substantial. Children are valued. They're looked at as security for the elderly. In other words, if you have a lot of kids, they can each contribute a little bit. They can take care of mom and dad when they're old. That's how children are viewed, as a source of labor. Consequently, education isn't always promoted, particularly for females. Ready source of labor. They can work on the family farm. They can do work to earn income. Typically in the West, you don't see that, but 100, 120 years ago, 150 years ago, it was very common for children 5, 6, 7 years old be working in factories in the United States and in Europe, both, in a very dangerous work. So it's not something that's unheard of. It is a reality. If you go to farms in this country, you often see kids that are very young working out on the farms. Symbols of status. So the more kids, the higher your symbol of status. So that is another part of it. Fertility, conditions for women, the age at which they get married, lack of education. Typically in Africa, you see women getting married very young. You often see, particularly in Muslim areas, where you might have girls as young as 8, 10, 12, 13 years old being married to men who are in their 30s, 40s, or 50s. Women typically are educated as a second choice. In other words, if all the males in the family are educated, the women may or may not be educated, may not be given that opportunity. And if a family has to choose between educating a son and educating a daughter, they're more likely to choose to educate the son. Urban versus rural. So most of the poor people are in the rural areas. You're having this mass migration from here to the urban areas, and you have these sprawling shanty towns around the major cities throughout Africa. And that's not uncommon. You see that in Latin America, you see it in Central America, you see it in Asia, you certainly see it in India. So within those countries, it's nothing that you're not seeing everywhere. Health concerns, of course, HIV/AIDS. You can see the percent of the population in these regions that have AIDS.